Late last week, I got my hands on a review unit of PSVR thanks to the folks at PlayStation, and it's been all I've been messing with ever since. My life has been kind of this sea of virtual reality games because I wanted to get a review out as soon as possible, but I also want to do a service to both PlayStation and to you, the viewers, by not rushing something out of the gate. So instead, what I'm going to be doing today is something kind of between a preview and a review. It's not as shallow as first impressions, but it's also not as deep as a full-on review of a piece of hardware. I don't want to give the impression that this is my final judgment on PSVR2 and its fortunes, but I also don't want you to think that I have spent just a little bit of time with this thing. I've been playing myriad titles for hours on end, but the reality of it is that there are 40 plus launch window games, and I've only gotten time with a handful, and I haven't beaten any of them. So I don't want to give or render a final judgment, but I do want to give you an informed point of view, because PSVR2 does hit store shelves here soon, and some of you have already pre-ordered, some of you may have already received your units by the time you're watching this. So let's talk about PSVR2, the value of it, how it changes the VR ecosystem and landscape, and whether or not I feel currently, based on my limited impressions, whether or not it's worth it. Because I think those are lots of things that are worth discussing, and it can get kind of complicated when you talk about VR. After all, there are tons of different competing headsets in a very narrow landscape, and not a lot of developers making games for them. There's a lot of overlap there. So I want to talk about my experiences with games that are both multi-platform and exclusive releases for PSVR 2, as well as my impressions of the hardware, the build quality, the image quality within the headset, which is very important, and everything else. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. First, let's go ahead and talk about the build. This is the PSVR 2. And in the hand, it feels quite similar to the PSVR 1 in terms of build quality. It's not by any means a cheap feeling device. It's pretty lightweight, however, which is good because you're going to be wearing this strapped to your face. And it sports a lot of design cues from the PSVR 1. For instance, this button up top, which moves the headset itself back and forth, bringing it closer to the user's eyes. And there's also a knob back here, which was present on the PSVR 1, though this does double duty now, where there was a notch up here for tightening and loosening the headband. That's now integrated into a dial on the back of the knob here. And this button, which was present on PSVR 1 as well, still works pretty much the same way, but the overall headset feels nice, though I wouldn't exactly call it premium. It feels different from other competing products. I think it's a notch above the Meta Quest 2, but it's not quite as premium feeling as the Valve Index, for instance, those big PC VR headsets that cost like $1,300. And I think that's just a case of kind of you get what you pay for here, right? The PSVR is priced fairly competitively at $550, which is a lot when you think about it in terms of how much the PlayStation 5 itself costs, but really not when you compare it to the existing VR ecosystem. Other headsets like the Meta Quest 2, which to me feel quite cheap, like with an elastic headband versus something like this, which is nice and adjustable with lots of padding. The Meta Quest 2 is like $400, so just $150 less than PSVR 2. And I get that it has it has its own internal processing power and processing capabilities. It doesn't need a console, but you also kind of get visual quality that fits that. It's basically wearing a phone on your face. Where this, you get the full visual fidelity of the PS5, which we'll talk more about in a bit, but can be very stunning at times. In here, we have our two OLED screens. These are coming in at, I believe, 2000 by 2040 resolution. That is double what PSVR 1 had. So the difference is essentially 1080p versus 4K, where PSVR 1 was essentially a 1080p headset because it was designed for a 1080p console. And this basically gives you 4K resolution for, each lens, which is, it leads to stunning image quality. What I can't show you is what the lenses look like and how it looks to be wearing it. That's one of the downsides of VR, is that I can't show you what games actually look like when you're playing them. I can show you captured footage of games, but that just looks like essentially a regular PS5 game, you know, with a very wonky camera because it's tracking my head movement. And I can show you my movement, but what I can't relay to you, the viewer, is the sense of depth. It's basically like if the 3DS were made perfect. If there was no issue with sweet spot tracking or anything like that, you just had a full-on, perfectly deep 3D visual presentation. I do want to bring the headset back to talk about the immersion a bit, because one thing that I am not a fan of is this rubber gasket. So this is meant to keep you from seeing what's going on around you, or to prevent light leaking in from the outside world to your view of the game. And while it does fulfill its main purpose very well, with PSVR1, I was able to look out the bottom of the headset and see my feet. With this, I cannot see around it. I can't see to the sides or underneath or above. I'm not able to see out of the headset when I'm wearing it, which is ideally what you want in VR, but it makes me sweaty. The rubber tends to make me sweat quite a bit. It's not enough to make me stop playing or to kick me out of my session and make me feel like I need to take a breather. But I do vastly prefer the cloth face coverings that come with the Valve Index or even lower end headsets like the Meta Quest. Though to hit that sweet spot in price, that $550, I assume that sacrifices have to be made here and there. Sony obviously went for a much more stable, much more comfortable headband, where Meta or Facebook or whatever you want to call them opted for something that, you know, is inferior, objectively inferior. So I'll take the more comfort in the headband over the rubber facial gasket thing any day of the week. Though ideally I would like both to be an option. Maybe a third party will come out with a cloth, you know, face covering that you can install, because I do believe that rubber gasket can be removed, though I have not modified or tried to modify my PSVR2 in any way just yet. But I would say that overall the headset, the construction of it is excellent. You've got outward-facing cameras so that you can see what's going on. On the underside of the headset, you have a button you can push that will let you see where you're at in the real world without having to take the headset off and look around. So it's very convenient. Every game supports this, so it just suspends the game to let you see and make sure there's nobody in the way, nobody you're going to hit, nothing going on. And it's a really convenient to use system. Sony's clearly put a lot of thought into how PSVR2 operates, how to make it as easy as possible for as many people as possible. Most VR experiences support both seated and standing or room scale. Room scale meaning that you can actually walk around and interact with things in the VR space as though you were actually there. It's a really impressive technology that usually utilizes external cameras, though lately the trend has been to use inside-out tracking, which is what's in the PSVR2, in order to enable you to walk around a room without having to mount cameras in places and without having to have external hardware to tell the headset where it is in relation to the virtual space. So it feels very advanced in that regard, in some ways more than even high-end premium headsets like the Index, which does still use external tracking. So it's interesting to see that Sony has taken some things from the lower-end headsets like the Meta Quest with the inside-out tracking, and some things from higher-end headsets like the Index with the headband design and with the much higher resolution screens. In fact, I mentioned it previously that the screens in the PSVR2 were very high resolution. They're actually even higher resolution than the Valve Index, which is surprising. For me, the Valve Index has been the gold standard in terms of image quality, and while it does have less of a noticeable screen door effect than the PSVR2, the PSVR2 is right at its heels. I've only noticed the screen door effect during intensely bright or intensely dark scenes, and even then, those are scenes where, I should say, where it's completely white or completely black. When I'm actually in gameplay where there's more than just one shade of color on the screen door effect is not noticeable or present at all. I'm not able to see any of it. And again, this is something that I wish I could show you, because of the fact that it's really hard to communicate these types of values without pointing a camera directly into the lens of the headset, and even then you don't really get the idea of what it is. There doesn't exist a really good mechanism for showing 3D, because you'd have to have a 3D display on the other end, at which point you're probably watching it on a VR headset. So it's really difficult to kind of convey the look and feel of these games, which is an unfortunate downside of just technology in general and not a specific issue with the PSVR. It's just impossible to show you the experience that you get. If you have a chance to check out a VR headset, I recommend doing it because that'll give you some idea of what it is you're in for. So if you've never checked out VR, you may have to buckle up while I describe some of this stuff. But we've talked a lot about the headset. I want to take a moment to transition to the controllers. Alongside the PSVR2, Sony introduced the Sense controllers. And these are really, really cool VR controllers. So to give you an idea, you hold one like so, and it kind of wraps around your hand, and you have a wrist strap, which you should absolutely wear. If you're playing a VR game, please wear wrist straps. You don't want to end up putting one of these through a TV or flinging it off or whatever. But they're very interesting controllers. I'm going to dive in here for a closer look. You have an analog stick, you have your circle and X buttons, you have the guide button, the PlayStation logo button, and a options or menu button, and then you have your R2 button on the back as well as the R1 button along the side. And what's important about all of these is that every single surface, with the exception of the handles, is capacitive, meaning that they register touch. So your circle and your X button are touch sensitive, your analog stick, your options button, your R1 and your R2 are all touch sensitive, and the same is true of the left-hand controller. It's essentially just a mirror image of the controller. So these are essentially two identical controllers with some minor differences. They also, you notice that these aren't the Move controllers. They don't have that giant glowing orb on the top, and that's because there are infrared LEDs within this kind of halo ring that tell the headset where the controllers are at all times, and during setup you'll actually see some like AR icons indicating which one's your left hand and which one's your right hand. Again, really cool stuff that Sony has implemented in these. These have all the same haptics as the DualSense, which means you've got resistive trigger functionality in these little guys. And it's just deeply, deeply impressive. I'm really thrilled with how well designed these are. They say these get about 8 hours of battery life, though I haven't fully killed one yet. If you do pick up the charger for the Sense controllers, you get these little magnetic USB-C dongles, which I'm not the hugest fan of because I'm afraid that they will get lost because you still have to pair your Sense controllers to your console via USB. You can't wirelessly pair them. They don't pair to the headset. They pair directly to a PlayStation 5 console. And if you have more than one console and you move this between rooms, you have to pair physically to each console that you use it with, thus meaning that you're kind of increasing the chances that you might misplace or lose that little dongle. I wish that they would have put contacts into the controller like they did with the DualSense, but maybe it was a cost-cutting measure, or maybe it was just a space-saving measure to keep these controllers as light and as svelte as possible. But I am impressed with them. Through hours of use, I have found that they're very accurate. They don't lose tracking. They don't have any issues that I've noticed. And like I said, the touch sensitivity works extremely well. They know that you are lightly on the buttons. You don't have to apply a lot of force. You don't have to apply a lot of grip strength. It just works. It works exactly the way you would expect a VR controller to work. And it's so much more ergonomic than the Move controller that it just feels natural. It feels like a natural extension of your hand when playing. It's clear that these were designed with VR in mind. All right, so we've talked about the headset, we've talked about the controllers. Now let's talk about what it's like to connect it all together and get it working. And that might be the most attractive part of PSVR2 for me. So if you're unfamiliar with VR, every headset has its own kind of unique set of hurdles and challenges. My least favorite is the Meta Quest, and I think people might find that kind of hilarious because it's the only one that doesn't require being hooked up to anything else. But the Meta Quest requires that you have a Facebook account, and that you're logged into it, and that you use Facebook as kind of your portal to all things Meta. And getting video out of that thing requires that you post it to like a Facebook group. It's really, really annoying. For me, that's a big problem with the Meta Quest. I don't really particularly love Facebook, and I don't want to have to interact with it to play games. So the Meta Quest is already not on the right path for me. The Valve Index has a bunch of external hardware. So you have two cameras, which are mounted in this studio, but my camera isn't high enough for you guys to see them. But I have one in one corner over here and one behind me in the opposing corner so that I can walk around this space behind me and play VR games. On top of that, it has a lot of issues that the PSVR1 had. In that there are multiple cables. So you have a USB cable, a DisplayPort cable, and a power cable all coming out of the Valve Index. And you can feel them pull on you while you play. And it means that every time I want to set up my headset, I have to plug all those cables together, which can be kind of onerous. PSVR2, on the other hand, is as advertised. It's a single cable setup. You just take the USB-C cable, plug it into the front of your PS5, and as long as your Sense controllers are paired, you're off to the races. That's it. If you're doing it for the first time, you do have to create a play area. And that's true of every VR headset, though the PSVR2's setup process for me was the easiest and most intuitive of any headset I've ever used. You put the headset on, and it guides you through the process. It's a little similar to the PSVR1, but with PSVR2, all you have to do is look around you, and it scans the environment and creates a play area. From there, you can adjust it. You can make it bigger or smaller as needed. If you're going to sit, you can just sit. And I thought that was really cool, but once you've got your play area set, that's it. It remembers that play area. You don't have to reset it. You don't have to do it every single time. Even if you unhook the PSVR from your PS5 and you leave it off, you're not going to have to reset that play area. The other thing I really appreciated about PSVR2's setup was that if I was in a different area of my room or outside my normal play area, it would ask me if I wanted to use a temporary play area. And I could say, yeah, I want a temporary play area and I want it to just be seated. And it'll just let me do that without having then to reset and do the whole setup over again, which is a really nice, really thoughtful measure that Sony came up with to keep PSVR2 easy to use. And I think that that has been, for me, the biggest barrier into getting more into VR. I have these headsets and I like using them, but the thought of setting them up and configuring them, I have to want to play for quite a while to make it worth it, and oftentimes it just isn't. So with PSVR 2, I just plug in my one cable and I'm done. And I really appreciate that about it, and it's had me catching up on VR games that I haven't caught because I've just been too lazy to hook up my headset for the whole weekend now. I've been playing Moss 1 and 2, Star Wars Tales from the Galaxy's Edge. I've been playing Horizon Call of the Mountain, and I have thoughts on all of those games. But for now, I just want to say that the setup process is easily, hands down, the easiest one of any of the headsets I've ever used, including the HTC Vive, the MetaQuest, and the Valve Index. So PSVR 2 is kind of punching above its weight in this regard. The user experience is far better, and you have all the convenience of the PlayStation capture system, all of which works in PSVR 2. So if I want to stream, I can stream directly from my PlayStation in VR, which is really cool. I can also capture footage from my VR games using the capture button on the left Sense controller, same way as I would if I was playing just a regular non-VR game. And I can also play my non-VR games in cinematic mode on a screen that is on a sliding scale from what I would call obnoxiously big to just the right size. I think at the smallest setting is where I felt the most comfortable. I like to have a good distance between myself and the screen, and cinematic mode can kind of simulate that. But I will admit I still prefer to just play my regular non-VR games on my TV. That's the most comfortable way for me to play them. But it is worth noting that if you don't have a 4K HDR 120 hertz TV set, PSVR can do all of that. So you can play your 4K games with HDR in 120 hertz within the PSVR 2, which is really impressive. And for a lot of people who don't have a cutting edge TV, this might be a way for them to check out all those features that they've been missing out on for these last couple of years. Speaking of games, let's talk about them, because this hardware is really cool, but it's not very cool without any games, right? Fortunately, like I said at the start of the video, the PSVR 2's launch lineup consists of somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 games. They just announced 10 more while I was recording, which makes it a little hard to keep track of. But to be fair, these are also launch window games. And what launch window means varies from publisher to publisher and from platform to platform. So we could be talking games that come out within the first week or two, or the first month or two, or the first 6 months, for all we know. A lot of these games don't have dates, but what I have played has been pretty impressive so far. Let's go ahead and start with the game people are probably most associating with PSVR2 because it's the only pack-in game you can buy, which is Horizon Call of the Mountain. This was certainly the first PSVR2 game that I booted up because it was something I hadn't played before on another platform. It was the big exclusive that ships with the headset if you choose to buy that bundle. And my opinions are kind of mixed on it. Again, I'm not super far into the game, so this isn't a full-on review of this game. I've played just a handful of hours, and I've had some pretty high highs and some kind of disappointing lows. But let's go ahead and talk about what my experience has been so far. So Horizon Call of the Mountain, like a lot of VR games in established franchises, puts you in the shoes of like a never before heard of character, somebody who's not integral to the mainline story of the other games. So you're not going to be playing as like Aloy. You're playing as kind of a nobody character who is in the Sundom and has to find his brother. That's all well and good. It's a good setup for a game. You see plenty of machines. You end up seeing, close encounters during the opening bit of the game. But what took my breath away was that Horizon Call of the Mountain is the prettiest VR game I've ever seen. Like, there are big, wide open vistas for you to check out. It doesn't feel lesser than a PlayStation 5 game. And that, to me, is pretty astounding in and of itself. I mean, it obviously doesn't look as good as, say, Horizon Forbidden West. That would just be impossible for them to do when you think about the fact that they're rendering 2 images, one for each eye, and they have to run it at a much higher than 60 FPS frame rate, because I believe the sweet spot for VR is 90 frames per second. So to hit that 90 FPS, you have to use a lot of tricks. And one of the coolest tricks that I've seen in the promotional materials and now in practice is a technique called foveated rendering. And what foveated rendering means is that essentially it uses the PSVR2's eye tracking feature to render the spot you're looking directly at in the most detail and to kind of strip away minor levels of detail from the areas in your peripheral vision because you literally can't see them in higher detail anyway because you're focused on one spot. So basically the game knows where you're looking and directs more processing power that way while reducing it in other areas to give you the illusion that the whole game is this sharp all the time and to keep that frame rate really high so that you don't get motion sickness while you're playing, which is definitely important. And speaking of motion sickness, and I can't believe this works. I've never seen this in another VR game, but Horizon Call of the Mountain utilizes a gesture-based movement system. And there are a ton of other systems, so you can use traditional stick movement if you're cool with that, or you can use like a teleportation system, I believe, which is something that's popular in older VR games. But they use a gesture-based movement system in which you hold the buttons and you pump your arms. And that is meant to reduce motion sickness in people that are susceptible to it. Usually when I use stick-based movement, it feels like I'm gliding along the floor in VR, and I tend to lose my balance a bit and get a bit queasy. But interestingly, just moving my arms in a running motion gives me the feeling that I'm actually moving. It alleviates that almost completely for me, and it's crazy how my brain can be tricked into thinking that I'm actually moving just by pantomiming running while doing it. So I found that to be really helpful and really impressive. What I didn't find so impressive was Horizon's combat. And that's really unfortunate to me because I think that's the thing I was looking forward to the most. The machines can truly inspire fear when you see them up close. But when you go into combat, you lose that ability to move freely. Instead, you can only dodge to the sides and shoot arrows. And the action of doing that feels great. The actual, shooting arrows and finding cover feels really good, but the fact that you're kind of locked in place and you can't run around the environment and use it to your advantage feels like a missed opportunity. I don't know if maybe it was just too complex and they had to keep those monsters at full detail or those machines at full detail, so they took away your ability to move too much so that the environment wouldn't tank the frame rate, essentially. But it feels more like a mini game than an actual combat encounter. It takes the fear out of it, even in VR where it's more immersive than ever. I just felt like I was thrust into a mini game where I had to shoot the weak point and keep moving on. And it led to Call of the Mountain feeling like an exploration game with combat tacked onto it. But the exploration is quite good. You don't have a focus, so you can't see all the details of everything the same way Aloy can. But you can climb around and look at things, and you can get some mild information. You can see footsteps and stuff like that. So I was able to, glean some information about the environment, and there are little things to look around for, like targets you can shoot and books you can find and keys and items to pick up, like blaze canisters that you can add to your arrows, and climbing parts, which climbing is a huge component of this game. You are going to spend more time climbing in Call of the Mountain in my early experience than probably anything else. I spent most of my time hand over hand climbing on things, and it's a really novel thing. It's a really cool thing the first few times you do it, but I feel that it wears thin pretty quickly, and I started just kind of dreading doing another climb and doing another climb and doing another climb, and eventually I was like, okay, I get that climbing is core to Horizon itself, but it feels like more of a chore when you're actually reaching your hands like this, as opposed to just pushing on an analog stick and watching Aloy do it. Speaking of watching Aloy, my coolest moment in Horizon Call of the Mountain so far was meeting Aloy, actually being in the same room as her and seeing her, digitally represented as a 3D object in front of my eyes. I was able to see how tall I am in relation to her, and that felt really cool. It was like meeting one of my heroes. It was really neat, and it makes me hopeful for the future. I hope that I get to meet Kratos in VR and be Spider-Man, and meet Astro and do all that kind of stuff. And I know that I just described 2 PSVR1 experiences back to back, but those aren't on PSVR2, and backwards compatibility is not a thing with PSVR2. I thought that would upset me more than it does. But when I look at the amount of innovation that Sony has put into PSVR2, how fundamentally different it is from the original, it makes me realize that innovation had to come at a cost. And that means that games would need to be significantly reworked for them to work on PSVR2. And some developers have done that. I played Moss Book 1 and Book 2. Book 2 is obviously, pretty new. It came out late October 2022. But Book 1 was a PSVR 1 game, and it's been remastered for PSVR 2, and it is, again, one of my favorite games on the platform now. So it's an incredible game, and probably the one I've enjoyed the most so far, because the idea of kind of looking into a diorama and being someone on the outside of this world and looking into it, and the character actually being aware of your influence, is a really novel concept that I think only works in VR, where I think games like Horizon Call of the Mountain are taking a game that works very well outside of VR and trying to find a way to make it work. I like the idea of games that were built purpose-built for VR, that do things that can't be done outside of the medium. So games like The Playroom, which were purposely built with VR in mind, I think do a really good job of showcasing the strengths of the technology. And while I do think Horizon Call of the Mountain, with its foveated rendering and gaze tracking and, individual finger control, do a very good job of showcasing what the tech is capable of, they don't feel like games that were built necessarily for the technology, where Moss and The Playroom feel like games that were built taking advantage of the strength and immersion that only VR can offer, where I think you could probably retrofit a lot of other games for PSVR pretty easily. And speaking of games that are retrofitted, Gran Turismo 7 is coming out with an update so that you can play that in VR if you already own the game. No Man's Sky, which has an excellent VR mode on PC, is getting its VR mode ported to PSVR 2. Resident Evil 8, or RE Village, is getting a VR exclusive mode on PSVR 2, and I'm sure there will be people who will go out and buy a PSVR 2 just to play RE8. But it's still very early going. I haven't played a lot of these games, and I'm looking forward to playing more of them, especially with you guys. For those of you that get a PSVR2 headset, I want to experience multiplayer VR, and I feel like the PlayStation ecosystem is probably the easiest, most accessible way to do that, because they already have strong multiplayer functionality built into the core of their platform, where I feel like it's kind of a crapshoot with Steam and especially with Meta to find people to play with that you know and you trust, and you know you're going to have a good time with. So I'm looking forward to checking out more of PSVR2's lineup as time goes on. I still have a few games that I haven't touched yet that I'm still very interested in trying. So I'll be giving more impressions on those. But my early impression of PSVR2's lineup is that it's pretty strong. There's a lot of games on PSVR2 that are available on other platforms or have been available on other platforms, but games like Moss have been retrofitted with better graphics and PSVR2 functionality. Games like Job Simulator and Vacation Simulator are kind of VR classics at this point that almost every platform that does VR has, but they're welcome additions to have here, because then you're not missing out on anything that you have on another platform if you've played VR elsewhere. And if you haven't, you don't have to hear about the games that you're missing out on, because a lot of the best ones are coming to PSVR 2. I wouldn't be surprised if we see stuff like Space Pirate Trainer coming out for PSVR 2, and other, maybe even Half-Life Alyx at some point, because the VR user base is pretty small compared to the wider console and PC gaming user base. So developers are going to try to recoup their development costs by having fewer exclusives and just kind of porting stuff wherever people will pay for it. So I have hope that we'll see Half-Life Alyx emerge on PSVR 2. But for now, I think that we've got a good, strong starting lineup. There's 40 games available, which is way more than the launch window for most consoles, let alone an add-on. But where does this leave PSVR 2? We've talked about what it does well and what I think it could be better at, but where does it fit into the existing VR ecosystem? And that's kind of in a better place than PSVR 1. I think that PSVR 1 had a lot going against it. It debuted kind of later in the PlayStation 4's life cycle comparatively, and it had a much more complicated setup that made it feel kind of like an afterthought. Like Sony made the PS4 and then decided they wanted to make a go at VR. So they had to include this additional box and additional power adapter and additional cables, and it was a very complicated setup. But Sony did prove their commitment to PSVR by nailing some pretty big exclusives. We had a Spider-Man game on PSVR. We had an Iron Man game on PSVR. We had Tetris Effect. We had a lot of good stuff show up on PSVR during its lifetime. But the PSVR 2 was very clearly designed with the PlayStation 5, like hand in hand, as is evident by that single cable setup, because I imagine behind the scenes there's a lot of magic going into making that work, and it works extremely well. If you had told me, a technical person, that VR was capable over a single USB connection, no matter how fast it is, I would have assumed you were on something. But it works, and without a hitch. It's perfect in its execution. So hats off to the hardware engineering teams at PlayStation for making this work as well as it does. I'm still confounded by how it was done, and we're just one step away from a wireless future where there's no cords, right? The only way you can improve on PSVR 2's setup is by somehow making it work completely wirelessly. But that being said, then you have the trade-off of having to plug it in and charge it, which you don't have to do with PSVR 2. You don't have to charge it. It doesn't have batteries. You have to charge the controllers, of course, but the headset itself just works power data off of that one cable, and I'm blown away by how easy it is to get into. So I think that it sits comfortably in the mid-grade for VR. You have your high-end products like the Valve Index, which when you factor in the PC that you have to hook it up to, you're talking about an investment in the thousands of dollars, and the headset itself costs about as much as 2 PSVR 2 headsets. And then you have the low end, where you have your essentially smartphone VR, which is the Meta Quest and stuff like that, where it's essentially like buying a Game Boy when you want a console. Now, to be clear, I don't think anybody who is solely interested in VR is going to buy a PS5 and VR. I think this is very much an add-on for the person who has a PS5 and has wanted to try VR. And I can't recommend VR enough. If you haven't ever tried it, the PSVR2 is the perfect place to get into it. Not just as a place to start, but a place to get into the VR ecosystem and have this be the way in which you consume all VR content, because it is, for its price, the best value in VR right now. There's nothing that even comes close. Between visual fidelity, ease of use, and library, PSVR2 is the best VR headset that has ever released. And I don't know how anyone's going to topple it, because again, with your high-end offerings, you need to have a high-end PC to power it, and you still have kind of a mess of cables unless you're willing to invest a lot in mods that can make it wireless. And then on the other end, you have kind of your cheaper VR headsets, and then way out there you have professional VR headsets, which I haven't even taken a look at. But PSVR 2 for me, for now, is going to be the way in which I play VR. I don't know how I'm going to be convinced to switch back to PC VR after having seen the quality of PSVR 2. So those are my early impressions. Make of them what you will. I really want to know what you guys want to see from me regarding VR content here on the channel. Do you want to see coverage of more PSVR 2 games? Do you want to see me include a PSVR section in my Game of the Month videos that happen on the last day of every month? Reminder, we're a week away from the end of February, so I'll be having another February Game of the Month video coming soon, and there's a good chance some of these PSVR 2 games will end up in that video. But anyway, let me know what you think of PSVR 2, let me know what VR games you want to see me cover on the channel, and we'll talk more about it in the future. Until next time, bye!